Welcome to the Drowned History, where the past lies beneath the waves. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of the most catastrophic and lucrative maritime disasters in history. July 31st, 1715. Off the coast of Florida, a hurricane struck without warning. 11 ships carrying the wealth of an empire, gold, silver, emeralds, Chinese porcelain, and treasures beyond imagination were driven into the shallow reefs and torn apart by the storm. Over 1,000 lives were lost, and a fortune that would be worth billions in today's currency scattered across the seafloor. This is the story of the 1715 Spanish treasure fleet, the ships that never made it home, the sailors who fought to survive, and the treasure hunters who, 3 centuries later, are still finding riches in the sands of Florida. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Are you listening from Spain, tracing the legacy of this lost fleet? From Florida, where the treasure still washes ashore after storms? Or somewhere else entirely? Drop your location in the comments below. I love seeing where our community spans across the globe. And if you're fascinated by maritime mysteries, by shipwrecks and lost civilizations, and the secrets hidden beneath the waves, subscribe to The Drowned History. We explore these stories every week, diving deep into the past that time and tide tried to erase. Now, let's descend into history. Let's return to the Age of Gold, when Spain ruled the seas, when treasure fleets crossed oceans carrying the wealth of empires, when a single storm could change the course of nations. This is the story of the 1715 fleet, and it begins not with a storm, but with a mountain of silver. In 1545, indigenous miners discovered something extraordinary in the mountains of what is now Bolivia. A mountain, literally a mountain of silver. Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, Potosí. At its peak, this single mountain produced more silver than anywhere else on Earth, so much silver that it would fundamentally reshape the global economy. So much wealth that the Spanish Empire became, for a time, the richest and most powerful nation in the world. But Potosí was just one source. Throughout the New World, in Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, Spanish conquistadors and colonizers found mineral wealth beyond European imagination. Gold from the rivers of Colombia, silver from the mines of Zacatecas in Mexico, emeralds from Muzo, pearls from the Caribbean, and everywhere, labor, forced labor, enslaved labor, extracting this wealth from the earth. By the early 1700s, Spain controlled the richest colonies in history. The mines of the New World were producing staggering quantities of precious metals. Estimates suggest that between 1500 and 1800, over 150,000 tons of silver and thousands of tons of gold flowed from the Americas to Europe, and almost all of it went through Spain. But there was a problem, a logistical problem that would define Spanish colonial policy for centuries. How do you transport this wealth across an ocean? In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the Atlantic Ocean was not just water, it was a war zone. Pirates operated openly. Privateers, state-sponsored pirates, raided with government approval. English, French, and Dutch warships prowled the shipping lanes, looking for vulnerable Spanish vessels. A single ship carrying treasure was a target, an irresistible one. Pirates would risk everything for a chance at Spanish gold, and Spain couldn't afford to lose these shipments. So they developed a system, the treasure fleet. The Spanish treasure fleet, or flota, was a convoy system. Rather than ships sailing individually, they traveled together. Dozens of merchant vessels loaded with cargo, escorted by heavily armed warships. There was safety in numbers. A single merchant ship could be taken by a pirate sloop, but a fleet of ships, protected by warships bristling with cannons, that was a different matter. The system worked like this. Twice a year, fleets would sail from Spain to the New World. They'd split into 2 routes. One fleet would head to Veracruz in Mexico, another would sail to the Spanish Main, the Caribbean coast of South America and Central America, stopping at ports like Cartagena, Portobello, and Havana. At these ports, they'd load cargo: silver ingots from the mines, gold coins, emeralds, indigo, cochineal for dye, Chinese porcelain and silk that had crossed the Pacific to Acapulco and then been transported overland, exotic goods from around the world, all funneled through Spanish colonial trade networks. And then, when the loading was complete and the weather was right, the fleets would rendezvous at Havana, Cuba. The natural harbor there made it an ideal gathering point. The combined fleet would wait for favorable winds, for the right season, for the moment when crossing the Atlantic was safest, and then they'd sail home, together, protected, carrying the wealth of an empire. This system lasted for over 2 centuries. It was remarkably successful. Pirates and enemy navies occasionally captured isolated ships or small squadrons, but full fleet captures were extremely rare. Spain managed to transport astronomical amounts of wealth across one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world. But the system had vulnerabilities. The routes were predictable. Everyone knew where the fleets would sail. Pirates and privateers could position themselves along the expected paths, waiting for stragglers or ships that fell behind. The schedule was rigid. Fleets needed to sail during specific seasons to catch favorable winds and avoid hurricanes. If they missed the weather window, they'd have to wait, and waiting meant costs, spoilage of perishable cargo, and restless crews. And most critically, the system concentrated enormous wealth in one place at one time. If something did go wrong, if a fleet did meet disaster, the losses would be catastrophic. Which brings us to 1715. By this time, Spain's power was waning. Wars in Europe had drained the treasury. The War of Spanish Succession had just ended in 1714, leaving Spain financially exhausted. The new king, Philip V, desperately needed funds. And for years, the treasure fleets had been delayed. Wartime dangers had kept them in port. Colonial treasuries had been accumulating silver and gold with no way to send it to Spain. By 1715, an enormous backlog of wealth sat in warehouses in Havana and other Caribbean ports. Years of mining output, stockpiles of silver, gold that should have been sent to Spain long ago. The pressure to move this treasure was immense. Spain needed the wealth. The colonies needed to clear their warehouses. Merchants and mine owners wanted payment. So in 1715, a fleet was assembled. Not a typical fleet, but a massive one. 11 ships, possibly 12, depending on which historical accounts you trust. These weren't just any ships, they were loaded with extraordinary cargo. The manifest, or what we know of it because some records were lost, included millions of pesos in silver coins, gold doubloons, silver ingots weighing thousands of pounds, jewelry commissioned by wealthy colonists, religious artifacts made of precious metals, chests of emeralds from the Colombian mines, and exotic goods, Chinese porcelain that had crossed the Pacific, silks, spices, cochineal for making red dye worth its weight in silver, indigo, vanilla, chocolate. The total value? Contemporary estimates suggested the fleet carried treasure worth over 7 million pesos, an almost incomprehensible sum for the time. In modern currency, adjusted for inflation and the historical value of precious metals, that cargo would be worth billions. Some historians estimate as much as $400 million to $500 million in today's dollars, though the true value is difficult to calculate because some items, like rare Chinese porcelain, have value far beyond their material worth. This was, quite possibly, the richest fleet Spain had ever assembled. And everyone knew it. In Havana, in Spain, in the pirate havens of the Caribbean, everyone knew that an enormous treasure was about to cross the Atlantic. The fleet waited in Havana through the early summer of 1715, waiting for the right weather, waiting for favorable winds. But there was a problem. The ideal sailing season was passing. Hurricane season was approaching. The Atlantic becomes treacherous from August through October, with massive storms that can appear with little warning. The fleet commanders knew this, but they were under pressure. Spain needed the treasure. Delays had already cost months. The crews were restless, the ships were ready. On July 24, 1715, the decision was made. The fleet would sail. They left Havana, heading north along the Florida coast before turning east toward the open Atlantic. This was the standard route, following the Gulf Stream, which would carry them toward Europe. The weather was favorable. Clear skies, steady winds. The fleet made good progress. For 6 days, everything went according to plan. And then, on the night of July 30th, the wind began to shift. The sea started to rise, and by the morning of July 31st, they were in the middle of a hurricane. Havana, Cuba, summer of 1715. The harbor is crowded with vessels, merchant ships, warships, supply boats moving between anchored hulls. The docks are chaos. Sailors, soldiers, merchants, dock workers, all preparing for the crossing. This isn't a routine fleet. Everyone knows it. The amount of treasure being loaded is unprecedented. The stakes couldn't be higher. And assembling a fleet of this magnitude requires careful selection. The right ships, the right commanders, the right balance between cargo capacity and defensive capability. Let's talk about the ships themselves. The 1715 fleet consisted of 11 vessels, though some historical accounts mention a 12th that may have sailed separately or joined late. These weren't uniform ships built to a single design. They varied in size, construction, and purpose. At the heart of the fleet were the Capitana and the Almiranta, the flagship and the admiral ship. These were the largest, most heavily armed vessels, designed to command and protect the convoy. The Capitana was typically a galleon of 500 to 700 tons, carrying 40 to 60 cannons. She would sail at the head of the fleet, setting the course and pace. Her captain and crew were among the most experienced in the Spanish Navy. The Almiranta sailed at the rear, ensuring no ship fell too far behind and protecting against attacks from the stern. She was similarly armed and served as the second-in-command vessel. Then there were the merchant vessels, the naus and urcas. These were the cargo ships, built for capacity rather than speed. They were broad-beamed, deep-hulled, designed to carry maximum weight. Some were over 400 tons, capable of transporting thousands of pounds of silver, plus general cargo. These ships weren't sleek or fast. They were workhorses, sturdy, reliable, able to withstand Atlantic storms when properly handled. Mixed among them were smaller vessels, patashis and advice boats, used for scouting, carrying messages between ships, and providing additional defense. Each ship was inspected before being approved for the fleet. Hulls were examined for rot or damage, rigging was checked, sails were repaired or replaced. This was going to be a dangerous crossing, and no captain wanted to be responsible for a vessel that couldn't keep pace or broke down mid-ocean. But ships are only part of the equation. What matters most is what they carry. And in 1715, they carried a fortune. The loading process took weeks. Treasure doesn't just get thrown into cargo holds, it has to be organized, documented, secured. Silver arrived in different forms. Some came as coin, Spanish reales, minted in Mexico City and other colonial mints. These coins were packed into wooden chests, each chest containing thousands of coins. The chests were sealed, marked with the owner's stamp, and recorded in manifests. Other silver came as ingots, bars weighing anywhere from 60 to 140 pounds each. These ingots were stamped with marks indicating their purity, the mine they came from, and the tax that had been paid to the Spanish crown. They were stacked in the holds, wedged in place to prevent shifting during the voyage. Gold was more compact. Gold doubloons and escudos, coins minted from New World gold, but also gold bars, jewelry, religious artifacts, gold chalices and candlesticks commissioned by wealthy colonists, gold chains, gold crucifixes. Then there were the emeralds. Colombia's emerald mines produced the finest stones in the world, and Spanish merchants had been accumulating them for years. These weren't industrial gemstones, these were display-quality emeralds, some as large as a thumb, destined for European nobility and the Spanish royal court. Pearls from the Caribbean, strands of perfectly matched pearls, each one painstakingly selected. Pearl necklaces worth fortunes. Worked silver, candlesticks, plates, decorative items. Some were Spanish colonial craftsmanship, others were indigenous work, looted or traded from native populations. And then the exotic goods. Chinese porcelain, the finest blue and white ceramics that had crossed the Pacific on the Manila galleon to Acapulco, then been transported overland to Veracruz or carried by coastal vessels to Havana. This porcelain was as valuable as silver by weight, delicate, rare, highly prized in Europe. Silks from China, spices, cochineal, tiny insects dried and ground to make the most brilliant red dye available, used for everything from military uniforms to religious vestments. Cochineal was expensive enough that it was carried in locked chests, treated as carefully as precious metals. Indigo for blue dye, vanilla, cacao, exotic woods. Every item was recorded. Manifests were created in triplicate. One copy stayed with the ship's captain, one went to the fleet commander, and one was sent back to Havana to be forwarded to Spain by a separate vessel in case the fleet was lost. But not everything was recorded, because in addition to the official cargo, the treasure that belonged to the Spanish crown or legitimate merchants, there was also contraband. Spain had strict regulations about what could be traded and who could trade it, but regulations and reality are often different things. Sailors hid coins in their personal effects. Merchants underreported the amount of silver they were shipping to avoid taxes. Officials accepted bribes to overlook discrepancies in manifests. The actual amount of treasure aboard the 1715 fleet was almost certainly higher than the official records indicate. How much higher? We'll never know exactly. But modern treasure hunters have found coins and artifacts that don't appear in any known manifest. The hidden treasure, the unrecorded wealth, may have been significant. Now, let's talk about the people aboard these ships. A treasure fleet wasn't just treasure, it was a floating city. Thousands of people, all dependent on these vessels for survival. Each ship had a core crew. Sailors who managed the sails, maintained the rigging, steered the ship, handled the anchors. The crew size varied by ship, but a typical merchant vessel of 400 tons might have 50 to 80 sailors. The Capitana and Almiranta, being warships, had larger crews, sometimes over 100 men, because they needed enough sailors to man the cannons during battle while still operating the ship. Then there were the soldiers. Spanish fleets didn't just carry sailors, they carried infantry. Soldiers trained to repel boarders, to fight pirates, to defend the treasure if the ship was attacked. These weren't sailors, they were land fighters, often seasick and miserable, but armed with muskets and pikes and stationed strategically on each vessel. A large galleon might carry 50 to 100 soldiers. Beyond crew and soldiers, there were officers. The captain, of course, but also the pilot, the navigator who determined the ship's position and course, the master, responsible for the ship's rigging and maintenance, the bosun who supervised the crew, the gunner who managed the cannons and powder stores. Then there were passengers, merchants traveling with their cargo, wanting to ensure it reached Spain safely, colonial officials returning home after years in the New World, priests and missionaries, families, wives and children of officials or merchants, and enslaved people. The Spanish colonial system relied on slavery, and ships often carried enslaved individuals being transported to Spain or between colonies. All told, the 1715 fleet probably carried somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 people, maybe more. The exact number is lost to history because many passengers weren't officially recorded. These weren't just anonymous masses, these were individuals. Men who'd spent years in colonial mines or plantations finally heading home. Sailors who'd crossed the Atlantic dozens of times. Soldiers who'd never seen the ocean before being assigned to fleet duty. Children who'd been born in the New World and were seeing Europe for the first time. Each ship was a small society, hierarchical, cramped, often tense. Officers had cabins, common sailors slept in hammocks in the lower decks, packed together in the dark, breathing stale air heavy with the smell of tar, bilge water, and unwashed bodies. The food was basic: hardtack, salt pork, dried beans, whatever could survive weeks at sea. Fresh water was rationed, stored in barrels that quickly developed algae and an unpleasant taste. Life aboard a Spanish treasure ship was uncomfortable at best. At worst, in storms, in battle, in disease, it was hell. But they went anyway, because for sailors, it was a living. For soldiers, it was duty. For merchants and passengers, it was necessary. The fleet system was the only safe way to cross the Atlantic. Which brings us to the risks. Because despite all the precautions, the armed warships, the convoy system, the careful route planning, crossing the Atlantic in the early 18th century was extraordinarily dangerous. First, there were the pirates. The Caribbean was full of them. English pirates operating from Jamaica and the Bahamas, French buccaneers from Hispaniola, privateers with letters of marque that gave them legal cover to attack Spanish ships. A full treasure fleet with warships was difficult to attack directly, but stragglers, ships that fell behind, that suffered damage and couldn't keep pace, those were vulnerable. Pirates would shadow fleets, waiting for opportunities. Second, there were enemy nations. Spain was frequently at war with England, France, or the Netherlands. Naval squadrons from these countries actively hunted Spanish treasure fleets. An encounter with a superior enemy force could result in capture or destruction. Third, there was weather. The Atlantic is not a gentle ocean. Storms could scatter fleets, driving ships off course. Hurricanes, especially in late summer and fall, were devastating. Ships could be dismasted, swamped, driven onto reefs or coasts. Fourth, there was navigation. This was before accurate chronometers. Determining longitude at sea was difficult, often based on dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed and direction traveled. Errors accumulated. Ships could end up hundreds of miles off course without knowing it. And finally, there was the simple fact that wooden sailing ships are fragile. Leaks develop, masts crack, rigging fails. A ship that left port seaworthy could become unseaworthy in a matter of days if damage went unrepaired. Every crossing was a gamble. Most fleets made it safely, but the ones that didn't, the ones that encountered hurricanes, enemy fleets, or navigational disasters, those became legends. And the 1715 fleet was about to become the most legendary of all. Because on July 24, 1715, when the fleet weighed anchor in Havana and set sail, they were heading into the worst disaster in Spanish treasure fleet history. But they didn't know that yet. On that summer day, the weather was clear. The winds were favorable. The ships were loaded, the crews ready, the treasure secured. They sailed north, following the Florida coast, riding the Gulf Stream toward open water. For 6 days, everything was perfect. And then, on July 30th, the sky began to change. Havana Harbor, mid-July, 1715. The fleet sits at anchor, fully loaded, ready to sail. But they wait. Day after day, they wait. The crews are restless, supplies are being consumed. Every day of delay costs money, wages for sailors, provisions, harbor fees. The merchants are anxious, the colonial officials are impatient, and in Spain, King Philip V is desperate for the treasure that sits just beyond reach. But the fleet commander, General Don Juan Esteban de Ubilla, hesitates. Because he knows something that kings and merchants and bureaucrats sometimes forget. The ocean doesn't care about politics, it doesn't respect schedules, and it doesn't negotiate. Let's talk about weather prediction in 1715, or rather, the almost complete lack of it. In the 21st century, we have satellites that can track storms from space. We have computer models that predict hurricane paths days in advance. We have warning systems that can evacuate entire coastlines. In 1715, they had none of that. What they had was observation, experience, and prayers. Sailors learned to read the sky. Certain cloud formations meant storms were approaching. A particular quality to the sunset, a deep red or strange yellow, could indicate weather changes. The behavior of birds and fish sometimes gave clues about what was coming. But these weren't reliable methods. They were signs, hints, indicators that something might be developing. They couldn't tell you when a storm would hit, how strong it would be, or which direction it would travel. For hurricanes, which Spanish sailors called huracán, borrowed from the Taíno indigenous word, the only real strategy was avoidance. Experienced captains knew that the Caribbean hurricane season ran from roughly June through November, with peak danger in August, September, and October. They knew that hurricanes formed in the eastern Atlantic or Caribbean and generally moved west or northwest. And they knew that if you were caught in one, your chances of survival were slim.
So the strategy was simple. Don't sail during hurricane season. Fleet schedules were built around this principle. Ideally, treasure fleets would leave the Caribbean by early summer, June or early July at the latest. That gave them time to cross the Atlantic and reach Spain before autumn storms made the European coast dangerous. But the 1715 fleet was already behind schedule, badly behind. The ships had been ready in early summer, but there had been delays, bureaucratic delays, cargo that arrived late from inland mines, disputes over manifests and taxes, the usual friction of colonial administration. And now it was late July. The weather window was closing. Hurricane season was approaching. General Ubilla knew this. His pilots knew this. The experienced captains knew this.
But the pressure to leave was immense, overwhelming. From Spain, messages arrived urging immediate departure. The crown needed this wealth. Years of accumulated treasure sat in Havana while Spain struggled financially. Every day of delay was another day without those desperately needed funds. From the merchants, there was mounting frustration. They'd invested everything in this cargo. Some had borrowed money to purchase goods for shipment to Spain. The interest on those loans was accumulating. They couldn't afford to wait until the next sailing season. That was a year away. From the colonial officials, there was administrative pressure. Havana's warehouses were full. New shipments were arriving from the interior. They needed to clear this backlog and resume normal operations. And from the crews themselves, there was restlessness. Sailors paid by the voyage, not by the day, wanted to sail and get paid. Soldiers wanted to complete their duty and go home. Passengers were tired of waiting, living in cramped conditions aboard ships or in expensive Havana lodgings. Everyone wanted to leave. Everyone except the man who understood the ocean. General Ubilla consulted with his pilots, the master navigators who would guide the fleet. What did they think? Was it safe? The pilots were divided. Some argued that late July was still acceptable. Yes, it was later than ideal, but plenty of fleets had sailed in late July and made it safely to Spain. The hurricane season was a concern, but it was a probability, not a certainty. Most summers saw only a few hurricanes, and the Atlantic was vast. The chances of encountering one were relatively low.
Others were less confident. They pointed to signs. The weather in recent weeks had been unstable. The heat was more intense than usual. There had been strange cloud formations. Some claimed to have seen unusual behavior from seabirds, patterns that, in their experience, preceded storms. But these weren't facts. They were feelings, intuitions. And you can't make decisions based on intuition when millions of pesos are at stake and a king is demanding his treasure. In the end, the decision came down to General Ubilla, and he made the choice that countless commanders have made throughout history when faced with impossible pressures. He decided to risk it. On July 20th, he gave preliminary orders. The fleet would prepare for immediate departure. Final provisions were loaded. Water casks were topped off. Sailors were recalled from shore leave. But even as the preparations continued, there was unease, not among the officials or merchants, among the sailors. Because sailors are superstitious, deeply, profoundly superstitious, and there were omens, things that to a modern observer might seem meaningless, but to men whose lives depended on reading signs that others missed, they mattered. One account, recorded later by survivors, tells of a sailor who reported seeing a ghost ship in the harbor, a phantom vessel, transparent in the moonlight, sailing silently across the water before disappearing near the harbor mouth. Ghost ships were considered terrible omens, a warning from the sea itself that disaster was approaching.
Another story, mentioned in colonial records, speaks of a priest who came to bless the fleet before departure. As he performed the blessing on the flagship, a sudden gust of wind, despite the otherwise calm day, tore the holy banner from the mast and sent it fluttering into the water. The sailors watching saw this and murmured among themselves, "A blessing interrupted, a holy symbol cast into the sea. Bad signs, very bad." There were other reports. A dolphin, normally considered a good omen, was found dead on the beach near the harbor, its body covered in strange marks. Some sailors claimed to have heard voices in the wind the night before departure, calling names, warning them not to sail. And several men reported dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams of drowning, of ships breaking apart, of treasures spilling into dark water.
How much of this is true? How much was invented after the fact when survivors were trying to make sense of what happened? We can't know. But what matters is that these stories existed, that sailors believed them, that there was genuine fear among the men who would crew these ships. Some sailors deserted, slipped away in the night, disappearing into Havana's streets, choosing to abandon their wages rather than sail. Ships always lost a few men to desertion before dangerous voyages, but the 1715 fleet reportedly lost more than usual. Officers had to search the taverns and brothels, rounding up reluctant crew members, sometimes pressing local men into service to fill the gaps. And still, the fleet prepared to leave. On the evening of July 23rd, General Ubilla held a final meeting with his captains. They gathered aboard the flagship, in the great cabin, around a table covered with charts. The route was reviewed. They would sail north along the Florida coast, following the channel between Florida and the Bahamas. This was the standard route, following the Gulf Stream, which would carry them northeast toward the open Atlantic and eventually toward Europe. It was the same route Spanish fleets had taken for decades. The pilots knew every landmark, every depth, every hazard along the coast. Once they reached the latitude of Cape Canaveral, roughly 28 degrees north, they would turn east, heading out into the Atlantic proper. From there, it would be open ocean sailing to the Azores, and then on to Spain. The voyage should take 6 to 8 weeks under good conditions, maybe longer if winds were unfavorable. But the key phrase was under good conditions. General Ubilla asked one final time, were they ready? Was this the right decision? The captains, pressured by the same forces that pressured Ubilla, agreed. The fleet would sail. On July 24th, 1715, at dawn, the order was given. Anchors were weighed, sails were unfurled. One by one, the ships of the treasure fleet began to move, catching the morning breeze, heading toward the harbor mouth. On the docks, people gathered to watch. Merchants whose fortunes were invested in this cargo, families waving goodbye to husbands, fathers, sons who might be gone for months or forever. Colonial officials relieved to see the fleet finally departing, and priests standing with their hands clasped in prayer, asking God to protect the souls aboard those ships. As the fleet cleared the harbor and entered open water, a ceremony was performed. The flagship fired a cannon, a signal that the voyage had officially begun. The other ships responded with their own cannon fire, a rolling thunder across the water. On deck, sailors crossed themselves,
Some kissed religious medals, others touched talismans they'd carried for years, rabbit's feet, stones from home, small carvings that they believed brought luck. And slowly the fleet formed up, the Capitana in the lead, the merchant vessels arranging themselves in loose formation, the Almiranta taking position at the rear. 11 ships, over 2,000 souls, and a treasure worth more than most nations' annual revenue. They sailed north, into the Florida Straits, beginning the journey that would take them home. The weather was perfect, clear blue sky, steady wind from the southeast, calm seas with gentle swells. It was, by all accounts, an ideal departure, the kind of conditions you pray for when starting a long ocean voyage. For 6 days it stayed that way. 6 days of good weather, good progress, no problems. The fleet made excellent time, following the coast, staying in sight of land, but far enough out to avoid shallow reefs. At night, they would sometimes anchor if the waters were unfamiliar. During the day, they sailed with confidence. By July 29th, they had passed Cape Canaveral, the point of no return. They were committed now to the Atlantic crossing. That night, some of the sailors noticed changes, subtle things, the wind shifting direction more frequently than normal, the temperature rising slightly, making the night air thick and oppressive, the waves developing an unusual pattern, longer swells coming from the east. The pilots noted these changes, but they weren't alarming, not yet. Weather changes constantly at sea. These variations were within normal parameters. But on the morning of July 30th, there was no doubt. Something was wrong. The sky had taken on a strange quality, a yellowish-gray haze that obscured the horizon. The wind had died almost completely, an ominous calm that experienced sailors knew to fear. And the barometer, that crude but useful instrument, was falling rapidly.
The pilots reported to General Ubilla. A storm was approaching, a major storm, and they were directly in its path. The general consulted his charts, his advisors, his captains. What should they do? They were too far from Havana to turn back. The wind would be against them, and they'd never make it before the storm hit. They couldn't head east into open ocean. That would take them deeper into the storm's likely path. Their only option was to continue north, hugging the coast, hoping to find shelter or ride out the storm at anchor in some protected bay. But the Florida coast had few good harbors, and the storm was coming fast. By mid-afternoon on July 30th, the sky had darkened. The wind had begun to pick up, coming in gusts that rattled the rigging and made the ships heel. The fleet drew closer together, trying to maintain formation, trying to stay within sight of each other as visibility decreased. By nightfall, the seas were rough. 8-foot swells, then 10, then 12. Rain began to fall, lightly at first, then heavier. The wind howled through the rigging, a sound like tormented souls. And the sailors, those superstitious men who'd seen omens and heard warnings, knew what was coming. The hurricane. The thing they'd feared. The reason they shouldn't have sailed in late July. It was here, and there was nowhere to run.
July 30th, 1715, evening. The fleet is strung out along the Florida coast, somewhere between modern-day Fort Pierce and Cape Canaveral. 11 ships fighting to maintain formation in increasingly difficult conditions. The light is fading, not just because night is falling, but because the sky itself has become a solid mass of gray-black cloud, pressing down on the ocean like a lid. The wind is no longer gusting, it's sustained now, a constant pressure from the east, building in strength with each passing hour. 30 knots, 40, 50. The seas are rising. Waves that were 12 feet an hour ago are now 15, 20,
crests breaking white across the darkening water, sending spray high into the air where the wind catches it and turns it horizontal, driving it like needles into the faces of sailors working on deck. On the flagship, General Ubia stands on the quarterdeck, one hand gripping the rail, watching the other ships. They're difficult to see now through the rain and spray, dim shapes in the twilight, their lanterns struggling to stay lit in the wind. He knows what this is. He's sailed the Caribbean for years. He's seen storms, but he's also heard the stories. The hurricanes that appear without warning and destroy everything in their path. And he knows with sinking certainty that this is one of those storms. Let's talk about how this hurricane formed, because in 1715, no one understood the mechanics of these storms. They were acts of God, divine punishment, or natural evil, depending on your theology. But we know now how they develop, and we know why this one was so catastrophic. Hurricanes form over warm ocean water, water that's at least 26 degrees Celsius, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The Caribbean and Western Atlantic in late summer are perfect breeding grounds. The water is warm, the air above it is humid, and the conditions are right for atmospheric instability. It starts with a disturbance, a cluster of thunderstorms over the ocean, usually moving west from Africa. If conditions are right, if the water's warm enough, if the wind shear is low, if the atmospheric pressure patterns align, those thunderstorms begin to organize. They start to rotate, slowly at first, then faster. The warm, humid air rises from the ocean surface, creating a low-pressure area. More air rushes in to fill that low pressure, and the rotation accelerates. The Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation causes the entire system to spin. And as it spins, it intensifies. The center, the eye, becomes a zone of extremely low pressure. The winds around it accelerate, spinning faster and faster, feeding on the heat energy from the warm ocean water. A tropical storm becomes a hurricane when its sustained winds reach 74 miles per hour. But they don't stop there. Major hurricanes, category 3, 4, or 5 on the modern scale, can have winds exceeding 120, 140, even 180 miles per hour. And they can be massive, hundreds of miles across, affecting entire regions, lasting for days. The hurricane that struck the 1715 fleet likely formed somewhere in the central Atlantic, possibly near the Lesser Antilles. It moved west, following the typical path, strengthening as it crossed the warm waters of the Caribbean. By the time it reached the Florida coast, it was mature, powerful, and it was moving at the worst possible angle. Because hurricanes don't just produce wind, they produce storm surge, a massive rise in sea level caused by the low pressure and the wind pushing water toward the coast. And they generate enormous waves. In the open ocean, hurricane waves can reach 40 or 50 feet. Near the coast, where they interact with the seafloor and shallow water, they become even more chaotic and dangerous. The 1715 fleet was caught in the worst possible position. They were close to shore, within a few miles of the Florida coast, because they'd been following the standard route north. But now, the hurricane was driving them toward that coast with relentless force. The wind was coming from the east, pushing the ships west toward the shallow reefs and sandbars of the Florida coastline. And there was nothing they could do about it. In the 18th century, ships couldn't motor against the wind. They were entirely dependent on sail. And in hurricane-force winds, sails become dangerous. They can rip apart. Masts can snap under the strain. Rigging can fail catastrophically. The fleet commanders made the only decision they could. They ordered most sails taken down, bare poles, let the ships drift with the wind, and hoped they could ride out the storm without being driven aground. But controlling a ship in hurricane conditions is nearly impossible. The wind doesn't blow steadily, it gusts, shifting direction by 30 or 40 degrees in seconds.
The waves come from multiple directions, making the ships roll and pitch unpredictably. And in the darkness, because by now night has fallen completely, the ships can barely see each other. Lanterns have been extinguished by the wind and rain. The only light comes from lightning, brilliant flashes that illuminate the chaos for brief moments before plunging everything back into darkness. Midnight, July 31st, 1715. The storm has been building for 6 hours. The wind is now screaming. Not howling, screaming. A constant, high-pitched shriek that drowns out shouted commands, that makes communication nearly impossible. The waves are monstrous, 30 feet, 40 feet, walls of water rising out of the darkness, crashing over the ship's bows, sweeping across the decks with enough force to tear away anything not secured. Below decks, the conditions are nightmarish. Water pours through every hatch, every gap, every seam. The ships are pitching so violently that men can't stand. They're thrown against bulkheads, against cargo, against each other. The treasure, those thousands of silver coins, those heavy ingots, those chests of gold, is shifting, breaking through restraints, sliding across decks. In some cargo holds, the weight of the metal moving unpredictably is causing the ships to list dangerously. And everywhere there's noise. The wind, the waves, the groaning of stressed timbers, the crack of rigging parting, the desperate prayers of men who know they're going to die. On the flagship, General Ubilla has lashed himself to the rail. He can't go below. A commander stays on deck, even when the deck is being swept by waves, even when there's nothing he can do to save his ship. He can see almost nothing, just darkness and spray and occasional lightning flashes. But in those flashes, he sometimes glimpses other ships, and he can see they're in terrible trouble. One vessel, he thinks it's one of the merchant ships, has lost its foremast. The mast has broken off 10 feet above the deck, and the wreckage is hanging over the side, held by tangled rigging, acting like a sea anchor, dragging the ship sideways.
Another is listing heavily, taking on water. Probably has a breach in the hull where the constant pounding has opened seams between planks. And all of them are drifting, west, toward the coast, toward the reefs. The captains know what's coming. They can't stop it. They can only wait and pray that when their ships hit the bottom, the impact doesn't kill them all instantly. Around 2 a.m., the first ship strikes. Which one? We don't know. The survivors' accounts are confused, contradictory. In the chaos of that night, no one could tell what was happening to other ships. But somewhere along the Florida coast, in the darkness, a Spanish treasure ship hits a reef or a sandbar. The impact is catastrophic. The bow, driven forward by the waves and wind, hits solid ground at perhaps 10 knots. The wooden hull, 3 feet thick at the keel, splinters. The force of the collision travels through the entire ship. Masts snap, rigging parts, and the next wave coming right behind lifts the stern and drives the ship harder onto the obstacle. The ship breaks, not cleanly, not like a stick snapping in half, but the hull fractures. Water pours in, and within minutes, maybe seconds, the vessel is coming apart. For the men aboard, there's no time to react, no time to abandon ship. The waves are sweeping the decks, carrying men overboard. Below decks, water is rising rapidly, drowning those trapped in the hold or pinned by shifting cargo. Some men are thrown clear when the ship breaks. They find themselves in the water, in the darkness, in waves 30 feet high, being driven toward shore by the hurricane. A few, a very few, will survive, will be washed onto the beach, half drowned, battered, cut by coral and rocks. Most will drown, or be crushed by debris, or pulled under by the current and never surface again. And the treasure, the silver bars, the gold coins, the emeralds, the porcelain, it spills into the ocean. Thousands of pounds of metal sinking into the sand and coral, scattering across the seafloor, some pieces embedding in the reef, others being carried by currents and buried by sediment. Within 20 minutes, the ship is gone, reduced to wreckage spread across a quarter-mile of coastline and seafloor. And there are 10 more ships out there in the darkness. Over the next several hours, they meet the same fate.
One by one, driven by the hurricane, they strike the coast. Some hit reefs offshore and break up in deep water. Others make it almost to the beach before grounding. A few were driven completely onto shore, their hulls smashing apart on the sand, their cargo spilling across the beach. The order of sinking is lost to history. We know which ships went down. We don't know exactly when or where each one met its end. What we know is that by dawn on July 31st, the hurricane was still raging, and the Spanish treasure fleet had ceased to exist. 10 ships destroyed. One, only one, had somehow survived. A smaller vessel, possibly one of the advice boats, managed to stay offshore, managed to avoid the reefs, managed to ride out the storm in deep water. When the wind finally began to decrease, when the gray light of morning revealed the aftermath, that single surviving ship found itself alone on an empty ocean. The fleet was gone, vanished, and strewn along 50 miles of Florida coastline was the wreckage of the richest maritime disaster in history. Bodies in the surf, broken timbers scattered across the beach, and glinting in the morning light, visible even through the rain that still fell, pieces of 8, silver coins, washing up with the waves. The treasure fleet of 1715 had carried over 2,000 souls and wealth beyond calculation. Now it carried neither. The people were dead or struggling for survival on a hostile coast, and the wealth was beneath the waves, scattered across miles of seafloor, waiting for 3 centuries, waiting for storms to uncover it, waiting for treasure hunters to find it, waiting to tell its story. The story of how one night, one terrible night of wind and waves and darkness destroyed an armada and created one of the most famous treasure legends in the world. The moment the armada vanished. July 31st, 1715, the day the ocean took Spain's fortune and kept it.
August 1st, 1715. Dawn. The hurricane has passed. The wind has dropped to a steady breeze. The rain has stopped, though the sky remains overcast, heavy clouds still moving across from the east. And along 50 miles of Florida coastline, from near present-day Sebastian Inlet south to Fort Pierce, the devastation is absolute. The beach is unrecognizable. What was once clean sand is now covered, buried in wreckage. Timbers, huge sections of ship hulls, some as large as houses, thrown completely out of the water and deposited on the dunes. Masts snapped in half, driven into the sand like spears. Sections of deck still intact with rigging attached, looking almost as if you could step aboard. Barrels, hundreds of them, some broken open, their contents, salt pork, wine, water, spilled across the beach, others intact, rolling in the surf. Personal items, sea chests smashed open, clothing scattered and soaked, books, their pages pulped by seawater, religious icons, crosses, rosaries, small statues of saints half buried in sand, and bodies, dozens of them, sailors in their salt-stained clothes, soldiers still wearing pieces of armor, passengers, men, women, a few children, some washed up intact as if sleeping, others broken by the rocks and coral, barely recognizable as human. And everywhere, glinting in the weak morning light, silver. Coins scattered across the beach like shells, silver bars partially buried in sand, gold glinting in pools of water left by the retreating tide. The treasure that was supposed to save Spain's economy now lies exposed on a hostile, uninhabited coast, free for the taking, if anyone survived to take it. The survivors emerged slowly, cautiously. Some had made it to shore during the night, swimming through the hurricane's surf, somehow avoiding being dashed against rocks or pulled under by currents. They'd crawled onto the beach, too exhausted to move, and waited for dawn. Others had clung to wreckage, pieces of deck, broken masts, floating barrels, and drifted ashore as the storm subsided. And a few,
A very few had been aboard ships that were driven so far onto the beach that they didn't completely break up. These vessels had essentially been deposited on the sand, listing heavily, their hulls cracked open, but providing some shelter for the men trapped aboard. The accounts from these survivors are harrowing, fragmentary, often contradictory, but they paint a picture of unimaginable chaos and loss. One survivor, a sailor named Francisco Ayora, later testified that he'd been thrown overboard when his ship struck the reef. He managed to grab a floating timber and hold on through the rest of the night. At one point, he said, he found himself surrounded by other men in the water, 20 or 30 of them, all clinging to debris. But one by one, as the hours passed, they lost their grip or were hit by debris and disappeared beneath the waves. By dawn, he was alone. Another survivor, Diego de Peña, a merchant, reported that he'd been below decks when his ship hit. The impact threw him across the cabin, and water began pouring in immediately. He scrambled for the ladder, reaching the deck just as a wave swept across it. The wave carried him overboard, but also carried him toward shore. He found himself in shallow water, being tumbled by the surf, battered by rocks and broken timber. He crawled onto the beach more dead than alive. A soldier named Juan Delgado testified that his ship, he thought it was the Almiranta, but in the chaos he couldn't be certain, was driven directly onto the beach. The hull split open, but the stern section remained partially intact. He and perhaps 40 other men survived the initial impact. They huddled in the wreckage as the storm continued to pound them. By morning, half of those men were dead, killed by injuries or by exposure to the cold rain and wind. The survivors faced immediate problems. They were on a coast that was largely unexplored and unsettled. The nearest Spanish outpost was St. Augustine, over 100 miles to the north. There were indigenous peoples in the area, the Ayes and Jaega tribes, but the Spanish had no way of knowing if they would be hostile or helpful. Water was the first concern. The survivors had been in salt water for hours. Many were severely dehydrated. Fresh water sources had to be found quickly. Next was food. The ships had been carrying provisions, but most had been lost or ruined by seawater. Some barrels of salt pork and hardtack had washed ashore intact, but not enough for the number of survivors. Estimates suggest between 1,000 and 1,500 people made it to shore alive, though exact numbers are impossible to determine.
Shelter was needed. The Florida coast in late summer is hot and humid. Men with injuries, with exposure, needed protection from the sun and from the insects that swarm in coastal areas. And there was the treasure. Because despite everything, despite the loss of life, despite the desperate situation, the treasure still mattered. Spanish officials who survived immediately began organizing. General Ubilla had survived, though he'd been injured. He took command, establishing a camp on the beach near what appeared to be the largest concentration of wreckage. His priorities were clear: survival first, then salvage. Because this treasure belonged to the Spanish crown, it had to be recovered, no matter what. Patrols were organized to search for other survivors along the coast. Men were sent north toward St. Augustine to carry news of the disaster and request help. Others were tasked with gathering supplies from the wreckage, anything that could be used or eaten. And salvage parties were formed to begin recovering the treasure that lay scattered across the beach and in the shallow water. This part was relatively easy. Coins and bars lying on the beach could simply be picked up. Silver sitting in tide pools could be retrieved by hand. Within days, they'd recovered substantial amounts, thousands of pounds of silver, numerous gold coins, other valuables. But that was just what was visible. Most of the treasure was underwater, buried in sand, or trapped in the wrecks themselves. And that's where the real challenge began. After several weeks, relief arrived from St. Augustine. Ships were dispatched, supplies were sent, and, crucially, salvage equipment was brought down. The Spanish had some experience with underwater salvage. They'd recovered cargo from previous wrecks in the Caribbean. And they had a technology that, primitive as it was, allowed divers to work at depths that would otherwise be impossible: the diving bell. This wasn't like a modern diving bell with air pumps and pressure controls. This was a simpler device, essentially a large bell-shaped vessel open at the bottom, weighted to sink. When lowered into the water, air trapped inside the bell allowed a diver to breathe while working underwater.
The principle is simple. Air doesn't escape from the bottom of the bell because water pressure holds it in. A diver could stand inside the bell with his head in the air pocket and reach out to work on the seafloor below. It wasn't comfortable. The air inside became stale quickly, the pressure made breathing difficult, and the time you could spend down was limited, maybe 10 or 15 minutes before you had to surface. But it worked. Spanish salvage crews had used bells like this before, and now they deployed them along the Florida coast. Divers descended into the wreckage sites. The water wasn't deep. Most of the ships had sunk in 15 to 30 feet of water, but visibility was poor. The hurricane had stirred up sediment, and the work was dangerous. Sharp wreckage, unstable structures that could shift and trap a diver, coral that could cut you badly if you weren't careful. But they worked. Day after day, week after week, month after month. They recovered silver bars, coins by the thousands, gold items, jewelry, religious artifacts, cannon valuable for the bronze they were made of, ship fittings, anything that had monetary value. The operation lasted for years. From 1715 through 1719, Spanish salvage crews worked intermittently along the coast. When weather permitted, they dove. When storms came, they retreated to St. Augustine and waited for conditions to improve. And they recovered a substantial amount. Estimates vary, but Spanish records suggest they salvaged somewhere between 40 and 50% of the total treasure, millions of pesos worth of silver and gold. But that means they missed 50 to 60%. And there are reasons why. First, the wrecks were scattered, spread across 50 miles of coastline. The salvage crews couldn't work everywhere at once. They focused on the sites that seemed most promising, most accessible. Second, the sand buried things quickly. Florida's coastal currents are strong. Sand shifts constantly. A site that was accessible one month might be buried under several feet of sand the next. Items that had been visible after the hurricane were covered within weeks. Third, the Spanish didn't have precise ways to mark locations. They used landmarks. The treasure is off the beach near the large rock formation, or near where the 3 palm trees stand. But landmarks change. Trees fall. Rock formations erode. And without accurate maps, relocating a salvage site after several months away was difficult.
And fourth, they simply couldn't reach everything. Some treasure had scattered into deep water. Some had wedged into crevices in the coral reef. Some had been buried immediately and was never found. By 1719, the Spanish gave up. They'd recovered what they could. The cost of continuing the salvage operation was exceeding the value of what they were finding. And Spain had other priorities, other disasters, other needs for resources. The salvage camps were abandoned, the diving bells were packed up, the remaining crews returned to Havana or St. Augustine. And along the Florida coast, millions of pesos worth of treasure remained, hidden beneath the sand, scattered across the reef, waiting. The Spanish had recovered perhaps 4 to 5 million pesos worth of treasure, an enormous amount, more than enough to help Spain's financial situation, though not enough to solve all its problems. But that meant 3 to 4 million pesos remained lost. In today's currency, that's somewhere between $200 million and $300 million in precious metal value alone. And some of the items, the emeralds, the Chinese porcelain, the rare artifacts, have values that far exceed their material worth. For the Spanish, the 1715 fleet disaster was a catastrophe, a financial blow, a tragic loss of life, a mark of shame that such a valuable fleet had been allowed to sail into a hurricane. But for treasure hunters, it would become something else entirely. A legend, a mystery, a prize that generations would search for. Because the Spanish might have given up, but the treasure was still there, waiting beneath the sand and coral of the Florida coast. And sooner or later, someone was going to find it.
That someone and the incredible story of modern treasure hunting on the 1715 wrecks, that comes next. But first, we need to understand what happened to this story, how a disaster in 1715 became a legend that would last for centuries, how the 1715 fleet transformed from a tragic shipwreck into one of the most famous treasure hunting sites in the world. That transformation begins in the archives, in the documents that survived, in the records kept by Spanish officials and later discovered by researchers.
And it continues on the beaches of Florida, where even today, after major storms, silver coins from 1715 still wash ashore. The ocean doesn't forget, and it doesn't give up its treasures easily, but it does occasionally offer hints, reminders, pieces of the past emerging from the sand. The 1715 fleet isn't just history, it's an ongoing mystery, one that's still being solved one coin at a time.
Time has a way of transforming tragedy into legend. The 1715 fleet disaster was, at first, simply a catastrophe, a documented historical event with records, survivors, and a clear cause. A hurricane that struck at the worst possible time in the worst possible place. But as decades passed, as the survivors died and the Spanish salvage operations faded from memory, something else began to grow around the wrecks. Stories, whispers, legends. The kind of folklore that attaches itself to places where terrible things happened, where fortunes were lost, where the dead were never properly buried. Let's explore the mythology that grew around the 1715 fleet, the ghost stories, the curses, the mysteries that persist even today. Because the Florida coast, where those ships went down, is a strange place, a liminal zone between land and sea, a coast that's constantly shifting, where the boundary between solid ground and ocean is never quite certain. And in places like that, stories grow like barnacles, attaching themselves to wrecks, to treasure, to the bones of the dead. The first legends appeared within a generation of the disaster. Spanish colonists in St. Augustine began to tell stories about the coast where the fleet had sunk. They said that on certain nights, particularly during storms, you could see lights moving along the shore. Lanterns, they said, carried by the ghosts of sailors who drowned in the hurricane, men searching for their ships, trying to find their way home. Some claimed to have seen these lights up close, glowing orbs that floated just above the water, moving against the wind, appearing and disappearing without explanation. Skeptics said these were just natural phenomena, St. Elmo's fire, an electrical discharge that can occur during storms, or bioluminescent organisms in the water, disturbed by waves and creating flashes of light. But the believers knew better. They said you could sometimes hear voices in those lights, Spanish voices, calling out names, shouting warnings about the storm. And they said that if you followed those lights, if you walked toward them on the beach, you'd find treasure, silver coins, newly exposed by the tide, gold that had been buried for decades, suddenly visible. But there was a price, because treasure taken from the dead comes with consequences. The curse stories emerged early, and they all followed a pattern. Someone, a fisherman, a beachcomber, a local resident, would find treasure from the 1715 wrecks, a handful of coins, maybe a silver bar, sometimes something more valuable, a gold chain, an emerald, a religious artifact. They'd take it home, excited, planning how to spend their newfound wealth. And then things would start to go wrong. Accidents, illness, financial misfortune, family members dying unexpectedly, crops failing, boats sinking, one disaster after another, all seemingly connected to the treasure they'd found. Eventually, terrified, they'd return the treasure to the beach, throw it back into the ocean, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes their luck would change, the curse would lift.
One particularly famous story involves a farmer named Josiah Mendez who lived near present-day Sebastian in the late 1700s. According to the tale, he found a chest of silver coins after a storm had eroded part of the beach. He was overjoyed. This was more money than he'd see in a lifetime of farming. He took the chest home and buried it in his barn. Within a week, his cattle began dying, a mysterious illness that the local veterinarians couldn't explain. His crops withered despite adequate rain. His wife fell seriously ill with a fever that no treatment could break. And at night, he claimed, he could hear voices, Spanish voices, coming from the barn where he'd hidden the treasure. Men speaking in urgent tones, though he couldn't make out the words. His neighbors said he should return the treasure, that it was cursed, that the dead don't give up their gold willingly. Mendez refused at first. He needed that money. His farm was failing. His wife was dying. The treasure was his only hope. But the voices got louder, and one night he swore he saw them, ghostly figures in Spanish colonial dress, standing in his barn, surrounding the buried chest. The next morning, he dug up the chest and carried it back to the beach. He waded into the surf and threw it as far as he could, watching it sink beneath the waves. Within days, his wife's fever broke. The cattle stopped dying. The crops began to recover. Is the story true? Probably not in the literal sense, but stories like this became common along the Florida coast, and they had an effect. They made people wary of the treasure, fearful of taking it, which, incidentally, may have been the point. If you were a local resident who knew where treasure could be found, spreading curse stories was an excellent way to keep others from looking, to preserve your own private salvage operation. But not all the legends were about curses. Some were about something stranger. Ghost ships. Multiple accounts spanning from the 1700s through the early 1900s describe sightings of spectral vessels off the Florida coast, ships that appear at night, often during storms, sailing parallel to shore. They're described consistently, old Spanish galleons, sails intact but shredded and tattered, moving against the wind. No lights visible except sometimes a dim glow from the stern cabin, no crew visible on deck. The ships sail north, always north, following the route the 1715 fleet would have taken. And then, as suddenly as they appear, they vanish, fading into mist or simply disappearing between one wave and the next. Sailors and coastal residents developed a superstition. If you saw a ghost ship, treasure would be found soon. The spirits were showing you where to look, guiding you to their lost gold. A ship's captain named William Ferris recorded one of the most detailed sightings in 1843. His merchant vessel was anchored off the Florida coast during a storm, and around midnight he saw what he described as a great galleon of ancient design sailing past, perhaps 100 yards away. He wrote in his log that the ship was clearly Spanish, with the characteristic high stern castle and ornate decorations, but it was translucent. He could see stars through the sails, and there was no sound, no creaking of rigging, no splash of bow waves. It moved in complete silence. He watched it for perhaps 5 minutes before it faded from view, as if dissolving into the rain. The next morning, when the storm had passed, his crew reported finding silver coins washed up on the beach where they'd taken shelter, coins dated 1715. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the pattern repeated. Sightings of ghost ships often preceded discoveries of treasure. Whether that's because the sightings were real or because people who believed they'd seen ghosts searched more carefully for treasure is impossible to say. But the most persistent legends involve the ships that were never found. Because here's a mystery that remains unsolved. We know 11 ships left Havana. We know 10 were destroyed. 1 survived and made it back to Havana. But Spanish records from the period are incomplete. Some documents were lost. Others are contradictory. And there's a persistent question among historians. Were there actually 12 ships in the fleet? Some manifests suggest an additional vessel,
a smaller ship, possibly a patoche or advice boat, that joined the fleet at the last moment or was sailing in company with it without being officially part of the convoy. This ship doesn't appear in all the records, and crucially, it was never found among the wrecks. Did it sink in deep water beyond the coastal zone where the other ships were lost? That's the most likely explanation. If a ship went down in the deep Atlantic, beyond the continental shelf, it would be almost impossible to locate, even with modern technology.
Or did it survive? Could it have been far enough offshore to avoid the worst of the hurricane, managing to ride out the storm and then limping to another port, perhaps in the Bahamas or along the Carolina coast? There are vague references in British colonial records to a damaged Spanish ship that appeared near Charleston in August 1715. The ship was described as being in poor condition, with jury-rigged masts, and it departed after taking on water and supplies. No cargo was mentioned, which is suspicious. Why would a Spanish merchant vessel have no cargo? Unless it did have cargo, treasure cargo, and the crew decided not to report it, to keep it for themselves rather than delivering it to Spanish authorities. It's a tantalizing possibility, a mystery ship carrying perhaps hundreds of thousands of pesos worth of treasure disappearing into history. Some treasure hunters believe this ship exists, that somewhere in a hidden cove, in a river mouth, on some isolated beach, there's a 12th wreck waiting to be found, a wreck that would still contain its complete cargo, untouched by Spanish salvage operations. It's probably just a legend, a story that persists because people want it to be true, because the idea of one more ship, one more treasure cache is irresistible. But in 2011, a sonar survey off the coast of Georgia detected what appeared to be a shipwreck in deep water. The signature was consistent with a 17th or 18th century vessel. No one has dived on it yet. It's in over 200 feet of water, which makes it expensive and dangerous to investigate. Could it be the missing ship? Probably not. There are hundreds of wrecks along the Atlantic coast. But maybe, just maybe. That's the nature of these legends. They persist because they're just plausible enough to be true, just mysterious enough to capture imagination. And they serve a purpose. They keep the story alive. They make the 1715 fleet more than just a historical event. They make it a living mystery. Because the truth is, despite everything we know about the fleet, the historical records, the Spanish salvage reports, the modern archaeological work, there are still questions. We don't know exactly how many people were aboard. Estimates range from 2,000 to 2,500, but no complete roster exists. We don't know the exact value of the treasure. The manifests are incomplete. The contraband was never recorded. Modern estimates vary wildly. We don't know where all 10 wrecks are. Several have been located and extensively salvaged, but a few have never been definitively identified. They're out there, somewhere along that 50-mile stretch of coast, buried under sand that shifts with every storm. And we don't know how much treasure remains. The Spanish recovered millions. Modern treasure hunters have recovered millions more, but how much is still there? 10%? 20? 50? No one knows. And that unknowing is what keeps people searching, what keeps the legends alive. The curse of the fleet isn't really a supernatural curse. It's the curse of mystery, of unanswered questions, of treasure that's just barely out of reach. It's the curse that says, there's something valuable here, something important, something lost, and if you're clever enough, lucky enough, persistent enough, you might find it. That curse has driven treasure hunters for 3 centuries, and it will drive them for centuries more. Because the ocean doesn't give up its secrets easily. It holds them, guards them, releases them only reluctantly, one coin at a time, one artifact at a time. And along the Florida coast, where the 1715 fleet went down, the ocean is still holding secrets, still guarding treasure, still keeping the mystery alive.
The ghosts may or may not be real. The curses may or may not be supernatural. But the treasure, that's real. We know it's there, somewhere beneath the sand and coral, waiting, guarded by time and tide and legend, waiting for someone to find it.
For over 2 centuries, the 1715 fleet lay undisturbed. Oh, coins still washed ashore occasionally after storms. Local residents knew there was treasure somewhere off the coast, but serious, organized salvage attempts had ended when the Spanish gave up in 1719. The wrecks remained, buried under sand, scattered across 50 miles of Florida coastline, forgotten by everyone except historians and a few dreamers who believed treasure hunting was more than just fantasy. And then, in the mid-20th century, technology caught up with ambition. Let's talk about how modern treasure hunting was born on the 1715 wrecks and how a handful of determined individuals transformed treasure hunting from a romantic notion into a legitimate, if controversial, profession. The story really begins in the 1950s. World War II had ended, surplus military equipment was flooding the civilian market, and 2 technologies developed and refined during the war were about to change underwater exploration forever. Scuba gear, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. The concept had existed before the war, but it was Jacques Cousteau and Émile Gagnon who perfected it in 1943. They developed a demand regulator that automatically supplied air at the correct pressure as a diver descended or ascended. Suddenly, divers weren't limited to a few minutes underwater with held breath. They weren't tethered to the surface by air hoses. They could descend to 100, 150, even 200 feet and stay there for extended periods. This was revolutionary, and treasure hunters immediately recognized its potential. The second technology was sonar. Originally developed for submarine detection, sonar could map the seafloor, detect objects buried in sand, identify the signatures of metal and other materials. Combine scuba with sonar, and suddenly searching for shipwrecks became practical. You could survey large areas of seafloor relatively quickly, and when you found something promising, you could dive on it immediately. Several treasure hunters began working the Florida coast in the early 1950s. Most were amateurs, adventurers, dreamers, people who'd heard the old stories about the 1715 fleet and decided to try their luck. They worked the shallow waters near shore, searching in areas where storms had recently eroded the sand. Sometimes they found coins, sometimes they found artifacts, small finds that suggested they were in the right area. But the breakthrough, the discovery that would prove the 1715 wrecks could still yield treasure, came in 1960. A man named Kip Wagner was walking the beach near Sebastian Inlet after a particularly strong storm. Wagner wasn't a professional treasure hunter. He was a construction worker with a hobby. He'd been collecting coins from the beach for years, coins that washed ashore after storms, blackened and encrusted but still recognizable. He'd accumulated quite a collection, Spanish coins, most of them, and several dated to 1715. Wagner knew the history. He knew about the fleet, and he believed, correctly as it turned out, that these coins were washing out of wrecks that still existed offshore. So he started searching, methodically, using the most basic equipment, a mask, fins, and snorkel at first, then later scuba gear. He searched the waters off Sebastian Beach, looking for any sign of a wreck. And in 1960, he found something, a dark shape on the seafloor in about 15 feet of water. When he dived on it, he realized what he was looking at. Cannon. Several of them, bronze cannon, heavily encrusted with coral and marine growth, but unmistakably cannon. And around them, scattered in the sand, were coins, hundreds of them. Wagner marked the location and returned with friends. They began a systematic excavation, and what they found confirmed it. This was one of the 1715 wrecks. They recovered coins by the thousands, silver pieces of 8, gold doubloons and escudos, not just a handful, not a lucky find after a storm, but a concentrated deposit of treasure still in situ at the wreck site. They also found other artifacts, gold chains, silver utensils, a gold ring with an emerald, musket balls, ship fittings, pottery shards. This wasn't someone's imagination, this wasn't folklore, this was real.
Wagner and his team, which eventually formalized into a company called the Real 8 Corporation, continued working the site. And over the following years, they recovered millions of dollars worth of treasure. But they also did something important. They documented their finds. They worked with archaeologists and historians. They understood that these wrecks weren't just treasure sources, they were historical sites with scientific value. Wagner's discovery sparked a treasure hunting boom along the Florida coast. Suddenly, everyone wanted to find a 1715 wreck. Dozens of salvage companies formed. Some were professional operations with investors and proper equipment. Others were small groups of divers pooling their money for boats and gear. The state of Florida got involved. Laws were passed regulating treasure salvage. Permits were required. Recovered artifacts had to be reported. A percentage of finds had to be turned over to the state for museum display. It was messy. There were legal battles over salvage rights, disputes about who found what and where, accusations of theft, of claim jumping, of failure to report finds. But the treasure kept coming. In 1964, Kip Wagner's team made another significant discovery. They found a wreck site that contained unusual artifacts, gold jewelry, high-quality emeralds, religious artifacts made of gold and encrusted with precious stones. And most strikingly, they found what appeared to be pieces of a royal commission, ornate gold items that seemed too elaborate to be ordinary trade goods. The speculation began immediately. Could this be treasure destined for the Spanish royal family? Gifts being sent to the queen? Personal effects of someone of extremely high rank? The press loved it. They dubbed the find the Queen's Jewels, though there was no definitive proof the items had belonged to any queen. What they recovered included a gold pectoral cross set with emeralds, a stunning piece, perhaps 6 inches tall, crafted with extraordinary skill. Each emerald was perfectly cut, deep green of exceptional quality. There was also a gold dragon pendant, intricately worked with ruby eyes, a gold whistle, probably used by a ship's officer to signal commands, gold chains of various lengths and styles, rings with large gemstones, and coins, always coins. Gold doubloons worth 8 escudos, the famous royal coins that represented enormous value in the colonial period.
The Queen's Jewels find generated international attention. It proved that the 1715 wrecks still contained not just bulk treasure, silver bars and common coins, but high-value artifacts that had somehow escaped the Spanish salvage operations. Why had the Spanish missed these items? Possibly because they were in a section of wreck that was deeply buried, or perhaps they'd been in a cabin or chest that the Spanish salvors never located. Or maybe these items had spilled from the wreck and been scattered, ending up far from the main debris field. Whatever the reason, the discovery validated what treasure hunters had believed all along. The 1715 fleet still had secrets, still had treasure. And with modern technology, those secrets could be found. Through the 1960s and 1970s, discoveries continued. Different salvage companies worked different wreck sites. The state of Florida established the Division of Historical Resources to oversee salvage operations and preserve significant finds. Mel Fisher, who would later become famous for finding the Atocha in 1985, cut his teeth on the 1715 wrecks.
He developed many of the techniques that modern treasure hunters use, like the mailbox deflector, a device that redirects a boat's propeller wash downwards, blowing sand away from the seafloor and exposing buried artifacts. Fisher worked several 1715 sites in the 1960s before moving on to search for other Spanish wrecks. But his time on the 1715 fleet taught him valuable lessons about patience, about persistence, about the fact that treasure hunting is 99% hard work and 1% incredible luck. The finds from the 1715 wrecks weren't just valuable monetarily, they were historically significant. Each artifact told part of the story of colonial Spain, of the treasure fleet system, of life in the 18th century. Chinese porcelain recovered from the wrecks showed the extent of global trade. These ceramics had been manufactured in China, transported across the Pacific to Acapulco, carried overland to the Caribbean, loaded aboard Spanish ships, and then sunk off Florida. They represented a trade network that spanned the entire world. Religious artifacts, crosses, rosaries, saints' medals, showed the deep Catholic faith of colonial Spanish society. Many of these items were personal effects, carried by passengers and crew. Finding them was like finding someone's personal devotional objects, preserved for centuries. Ship fittings and navigational instruments provided information about Spanish naval technology. Archaeologists could study how these ships were built, how they were maintained, how they were navigated.
And the coins themselves were historical documents. Each one was stamped with information, the mint where it was produced, the year it was made, sometimes even the assayer's marks that indicated who had verified its quality. By examining large numbers of coins from the 1715 wrecks, historians could track which colonial mints were most productive, how coin quality varied, and what denomination of coins were most commonly used in trade. But for all the discoveries, all the treasure recovered, one thing became increasingly clear. There was more, much more. The Spanish had recovered perhaps half the treasure. Modern salvers had found millions of dollars more, but mathematical models based on manifests and historical records suggested that perhaps 30 to 40% of the original treasure was still out there. Buried under sand that shifted with every storm, scattered across miles of seafloor, hidden in sections of wreck that hadn't been found yet. And with every hurricane, with every major storm, new sections of wreck would be exposed. Sand would shift. Artifacts that had been buried for decades would suddenly be accessible. Treasure hunters learned to monitor weather. After a hurricane or tropical storm, they'd rush to the wreck sites to see what had been exposed. Sometimes they'd find nothing. The storm had buried things deeper. But other times, they'd find concentrations of coins, artifacts, sections of wreck that hadn't been visible in years. The 1715 fleet became a perpetual treasure hunt. Not something you could finish, not a puzzle you could solve completely, but an ongoing excavation that would continue for decades, maybe centuries. Because the ocean doesn't give everything up at once. It parcels out its treasures slowly. A few coins here, an artifact there, occasionally a spectacular find that reminds everyone why they're searching. The modern discovery of the 1715 fleet transformed treasure hunting. It proved that centuries-old wrecks could still yield valuable finds. It established protocols for how salvage should be conducted. It demonstrated that treasure hunting could be both profitable and scientifically responsible. But it also created controversy, because not everyone agreed that these wrecks should be salvaged at all. Archaeologists argued that treasure hunters were destroying historical sites, that artifacts ripped from context without proper documentation lost their scientific value, that the wrecks should be left intact for future generations to study with better technology. Treasure hunters countered that without salvage, the artifacts would remain buried forever, that storms and currents were destroying the wrecks anyway, that finding and preserving artifacts was better than leaving them to decay in the ocean. It's a debate that continues today, and the 1715 fleet sits at the center of it. But regardless of the controversy, one thing is undeniable. the modern discovery of the 1715 wrecks revealed something extraordinary: that treasure lost 3 centuries ago could still be found, that the ocean, for all its power to destroy, also has the power to preserve, and that beneath the waves off Florida's coast, history is waiting, waiting to be discovered, waiting to tell its story, one gold coin at a time.
September 2017. Hurricane Irma has just passed through Florida, a Category 5 storm that devastated the Caribbean and slammed into the Florida Keys before moving up the coast. Wind gusts exceeded 150 miles per hour. Storm surge reached 15 feet in some areas. The damage is catastrophic. But in the midst of the destruction, along the beaches near Sebastian and Vero Beach, something extraordinary is happening.
Treasure is appearing. Not treasure that's been hidden, not treasure that someone buried, but treasure that's been there all along, buried under sand and sediment, invisible for decades or even centuries, until the hurricane moved it. A metal detector enthusiast named Jonah Martinez walks the beach the morning after the storm passes. The sand looks different, carved and sculpted by the waves into new patterns, dark patches where deeper sand has been exposed, strange ripples and channels that weren't there before. He's searching methodically, sweeping his detector in careful arcs, listening for the telltale beep that indicates metal. And then he gets a signal. Strong, consistent. He digs. Not deep, maybe 8 inches into the sand. And there, gleaming despite 300 years underwater and buried in sand, is a gold doubloon, a Spanish 8 escudo coin, dated 1715. Martinez continues searching. Within an hour, he's found 3 more gold coins and dozens of silver pieces of 8. He's not alone. Up and down the beach, other detectorists are making similar finds. Some people find single coins, others find clusters, 5, 10, 20 coins in a small area, as if they'd spilled from a purse or chest centuries ago. The local news picks up the story. Hurricane Irma reveals Spanish treasure. Television crews interview beachcombers who display their finds. Treasure hunters from around the state descend on the beaches. And within days, people have recovered coins worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, just from walking the beach with metal detectors after a single storm. This isn't unusual. It's happened before, and it will happen again, because the 1715 fleet isn't finished revealing its secrets. Let's talk about why, over 300 years after the ship sank, treasure is still appearing on Florida beaches, why storms continue to expose artifacts, and how the ocean is still moving things around, redistributing treasure, bringing it within reach of anyone walking the shore with patience and a metal detector.
The answer lies in understanding how coastal dynamics work, how sand moves, how storms reshape the seafloor and beaches, and how artifacts that seemed buried permanently can suddenly reappear. Florida's Atlantic coast is constantly changing, always, every day, every tide cycle, every storm. The sand along the coast isn't static, it's in constant motion, moved by waves, currents, and tides. Sand moves along the coast in what's called littoral drift, a river of sand flowing parallel to shore, transported by the angle at which waves hit the beach. During normal conditions, this movement is gradual, slow. Sand accumulates in some areas and erodes from others, but the changes are measured in inches per year. Storms change everything. When a hurricane or tropical storm hits, the wave energy increases dramatically. Waves that are normally 3 or 4 feet become 10, 15, 20 feet. The surge pushes water far up the beach, flooding areas that are usually dry. And the powerful currents scour the seafloor, moving enormous volumes of sand. In a single storm, the coastal profile can change by several feet vertically. Areas that were buried under 5 feet of sand can be exposed, and conversely, areas that were exposed can be buried under fresh sediment. The 1715 wrecks sit in this dynamic environment. They're in relatively shallow water. Most are in 10 to 30 feet of depth. At those depths, they're constantly being affected by wave action and currents. When the ships first sank, they broke apart. Some sections stayed relatively intact. Others were completely destroyed, scattered across the seafloor. The treasure they carried, heavy metal objects, sank into the sand. Over the following months and years, that treasure became buried. Sand accumulated on top of it, and once buried, it stayed buried, protected from further wave action by the weight of sand above it, until a storm came along and removed that sand. Then the treasure would be exposed again. Spanish salvors would find it, or it would be reburied by the next storm. The cycle repeated endlessly, and it's still repeating today. After 300 years, there are still coins and artifacts from the 1715 fleet buried in the sand offshore. Some are at the known wreck sites. Others have been transported by currents, sometimes miles from where the ships went down.
When a major storm hits, it's like nature conducting a salvage operation. The powerful currents excavate areas that have been buried for decades. They expose artifacts. And sometimes those artifacts wash ashore. This is why beachcombing after storms is so productive. The storms do the excavation work that would otherwise require expensive equipment and permits. But there's a limited window, because after a storm passes, the normal coastal processes resume. Sand begins to accumulate again. Within weeks, many of the exposed areas will be reburied. Treasure hunters know this. They've learned to monitor weather. When a hurricane is approaching Florida, they're already making plans. The moment it's safe to go out, sometimes within hours of a storm passing, they're on the beaches, searching. The stories are remarkable, and they're not just modern. They go back centuries. In the 1920s, a fisherman named Charles Brooker found a gold chain on the beach near Fort Pierce. The chain was over 4 feet long, made of heavy links, worth a small fortune even as scrap gold. He traced it back to the 1715 fleet and realized he'd stumbled onto something significant. In 1965, after Hurricane Betsy, a school teacher from Vero Beach named Sarah Cunningham found 17 gold coins while walking her dog on the beach, just lying in the sand at the high tide line, exposed by the storm's wave action. In 2015, exactly 300 years after the fleet sank, members of a permitted salvage company found a collection of gold coins worth over $1 million during a single dive. The area they were working had been buried under sand for years. A storm the previous week had scoured the sea floor, exposing a debris field that hadn't been accessible since at least the 1980s. And then there's the story that's become legendary among treasure hunters. In July 2015, the Schmidt family from California was vacationing in Florida. They were on the beach near Sebastian Inlet, and their son, a teenager, had borrowed a metal detector from a friend. He was sweeping the detector along the waterline, not really expecting to find anything, just playing, enjoying the beach, and he got a signal. He dug in the wet sand, maybe a foot down, and pulled out something dark and encrusted. He wasn't sure what it was at first, but when he washed it in the surf, he could see the glint of gold underneath the tarnish. It was a gold coin, a Spanish doubloon, and it was dated 1715.
The family was ecstatic. They'd found actual treasure on vacation by accident. But that wasn't the remarkable part. The remarkable part came when they reported the find to the Florida Division of Historical Resources, as they were legally required to do. Archaeologists examined the coin, and they determined something interesting. This coin showed almost no wear. It looked as if it had been minted and then immediately sank. It hadn't circulated, hadn't been handled extensively, which meant it had probably been in a sealed chest when it went down, protected from the water, from the sand, from the abrasion that affects coins exposed directly to the environment. And that suggested something exciting, that there might be more coins nearby, a whole chest possibly that was beginning to break apart and release its contents. Within days, permitted salvors were diving in the area, and they did find more coins. Not a complete chest, that had probably deteriorated centuries ago, but a concentration of gold coins in a small area, all showing similar characteristics. How many coins total? The salvers won't say. Treasure hunters are notoriously secretive about exact finds, but estimates suggest it was substantial, possibly dozens of gold coins from a single cache. And all because a teenager on vacation happened to be in the right place at the right time, with a metal detector, after storms had shifted the sand just enough to bring those coins within a foot of the surface. That's the nature of the 1715 fleet today. It's not a fixed, static archaeological site. It's dynamic, living, still revealing itself. Every major storm that hits the Florida coast has the potential to expose new artifacts. And because the treasure is scattered over 50 miles of coastline, often in shallow water, accessible to anyone with basic equipment, the possibility exists that any beachcomber, any swimmer, any diver might stumble onto something significant. This creates complications. Florida law states that any artifacts from shipwrecks in state waters belong to the state. If you find a Spanish coin on the beach, technically you're supposed to report it to the Division of Historical Resources. In practice, many people don't. They find a coin, pocket it, and never tell anyone. It's hard to enforce, and the state doesn't have the resources to police every beachcomber.
For larger finds, though, multiple coins, significant artifacts, the legal issues become serious. Permitted salvage companies have exclusive rights to work certain areas. If someone else finds treasure in those areas, they're required to turn it over to the permit holder. But what about treasure found on the beach, above the high tide line, or in the surf zone where technically no one has exclusive salvage rights? The legal battles are complex and ongoing because the 1715 fleet occupies a strange space between archaeological site, private salvage operation, and public treasure that anyone might find by chance. But beyond the legal issues, there's something profound about the fact that this treasure is still appearing. 3 centuries, longer than the United States has existed as a nation, longer than most families can trace their genealogies, an almost incomprehensible span of time. And yet the ocean is still moving these artifacts, still redistributing them, still bringing them to light. It's a reminder of geological time, of the power of natural processes operating on scales we don't normally think about. Every grain of sand on a beach has a history. It started as rock somewhere inland. It was weathered by rain and temperature changes, broken down into smaller and smaller pieces, carried by rivers to the ocean, deposited on beaches, moved by currents and waves, buried and exposed countless times. Some of those grains of sand have been cycling through this process for millions of years, and in that vast expanse of time, 300 years is nothing. The 1715 treasure is just another set of objects caught in the endless movement of sediment and water. From the ocean's perspective, those Spanish coins aren't ancient artifacts. They're recent additions to the seafloor, temporary residents that will eventually be buried completely, become fossilized, perhaps be uplifted by tectonic forces and exposed again millions of years in the future, unrecognizable as human-made objects. But for us, in our brief human timescales, they're treasures, connections to the past, physical links to people who lived and died 3 centuries ago. And the fact that nature continues to reveal them, continues to bring them within reach, makes the 1715 fleet unique among shipwrecks. Most deepwater wrecks are stable. They sink to the seafloor and stay there. Sediment covers them, and unless someone specifically goes looking for them with advanced equipment, they remain hidden indefinitely.
But the 1715 wrecks exist in the shallow coastal zone, the most dynamic part of the ocean, where sand is always moving, where every storm is an excavation event. These wrecks will never be fully salvaged, never be completely excavated, because the ocean keeps hiding and revealing them in an endless cycle. 100 years from now, people will still be finding coins from the 1715 fleet, walking the beach after storms, diving in the shallows, detecting metal signals in the sand, and they'll experience that same thrill,
that moment of realization that they're holding something that hasn't been touched by human hands since 1715, something that was aboard a Spanish galleon, something that sailed from Havana, survived 6 days of good weather, and then sank in a hurricane. The 1715 fleet isn't just history, it's living history. Still active, still revealing itself, still waiting beneath the sand for the next storm to expose it, for the next person to walk the beach at the right time in the right place and find a piece of the past glinting in the surf.
"300 years of searching, millions of dollars recovered, countless artifacts brought to the surface, coins, jewelry, ship fittings, personal effects. And yet, the 1715 fleet still holds secrets, wrecks that have never been definitively located, treasure that remains buried under tons of sand, artifacts that may never be found, hidden in places we haven't thought to look. Let's talk about what's still out there, what remains undiscovered, and why, despite centuries of searching and decades of modern salvage operations, the 1715 fleet continues to guard its mysteries. First, the basic question: how many wrecks have been found? The historical record tells us that 10 ships from the 1715 fleet were destroyed in the hurricane, 10 ships carrying treasure, 10 ships that should have left wreckage somewhere along the Florida coast. Modern salvers have identified and worked on 7 confirmed wreck sites, 7 locations where significant concentrations of artifacts, structural remains, and treasure have been recovered. These sites have been extensively documented, mapped, and salvaged. But that leaves 3 ships unaccounted for. 3 wrecks that should exist but haven't been definitively located. Or have they? That's where it gets complicated, because identifying a specific wreck site as belonging to a specific ship from the 1715 fleet is difficult. The Spanish didn't GPS mark their wrecks. Contemporary accounts describe general locations, near the coast, opposite a distinctive rock formation, where 3 trees stand. But coastlines change, rock formations erode, trees die, and after 300 years, correlating historical descriptions with modern geography is nearly impossible. So we have wreck sites, scattered along 50 miles of coastline. Some are clearly from the 1715 fleet, the artifacts recovered, the coins dated to 1715 or earlier, the construction techniques matching Spanish ships from that period. But are we looking at 10 distinct wrecks, or are some of these sites actually different parts of the same wreck, scattered by the hurricane and subsequent storms? It's possible that what modern salvers call separate wreck sites are actually debris fields from a single ship spread across miles of coastline by wave action and currents over 3 centuries. Or, conversely, it's possible that some of the sites being worked contain artifacts from multiple ships that sank close together and whose remains have become intermixed. Without intact hull sections with identifying marks, without ship spells with names engraved on them, without definitive artifacts that can be traced to specific vessels, we can't say for certain.
So 3 ships remain missing in the sense that we don't know exactly where they are or whether what we think are their remains actually belong to them. But there's another possibility, one that treasure hunters don't like to consider, but that makes perfect sense from a historical perspective. Some of the 1715 ships might be in deep water. Remember the hurricane. Remember that the fleet was driven toward shore, but they weren't already on the coast when the storm hit. They were several miles offshore, trying desperately to avoid the reefs. Some ships made it almost to the beach before breaking up. Those are the ones that have been found. Their wreckage is in shallow water, 15, 20, 30 feet deep, accessible to divers, affected by coastal sand movement that alternately buries and exposes artifacts. But what about ships that broke apart farther offshore? Ships that sank in 60, 80, 100 feet of water, or deeper. At those depths, the dynamics are completely different. The wave action that moves sand around in shallow water doesn't reach the seafloor.
Artifacts that sink to 100 feet stay there. They don't wash ashore after storms. They don't get redistributed by coastal currents. They just sit there, buried under sediment that accumulates slowly over centuries. If one or more of the 1715 ships went down in deep water, and deep in this context means anything beyond about 40 or 50 feet, they could still be out there, completely intact, undiscovered. This isn't just speculation. There are historical precedents. The Mercedes, a Spanish frigate that sank in 1804, was found in 1,100 feet of water. The wreck was essentially intact, with most of its treasures still in the hold. It had sat undiscovered for over 200 years because it was beyond the reach of conventional salvage technology. Could a 1715 ship be in similar circumstances? It's possible. Unlikely, perhaps, given that most of the fleet was driven onto the coast, but possible. And there's one piece of evidence that suggests at least one ship might be in deeper water. Spanish salvage records from the 1716-1719 period mention one wreck that they located but couldn't work. It was, according to the reports, in deep water beyond the reach of our divers and bells. How deep is deep in 18th century terms? Probably anything over 40 or 50 feet. Spanish diving bells couldn't operate effectively below that depth. The pressure became too great, the air supply too limited.
So they marked the location, or tried to, and presumably intended to return with better equipment. But they never did. The salvage operations were shut down in 1719, and the location of this deep wreck was lost. Is it still out there, sitting on the seafloor at 60 feet, 80 feet, covered by 3 centuries of sediment but otherwise intact? Modern technology could find it. Side-scan sonar, magnetometers, sub-bottom profilers, all can detect shipwrecks even when buried. But you need to know where to look, and the ocean floor off Florida is vast. Searching randomly would take decades and cost millions. So unless someone discovers a historical document that pinpoints the location more precisely, that deep-water wreck, if it exists, will remain lost. But even the known wreck sites still hold secrets, because salvage operations, thorough as they've been, can't recover everything. Sand is the problem. Always sand. Modern salvage techniques are sophisticated. Salvers use mailbox deflectors to blow sand away from wreck sites, exposing artifacts. They use dredges to remove sediment. They use metal detectors and magnetometers to locate buried objects. But the sand keeps coming back. A site that's been completely excavated, worked for months, every visible artifact recovered, that site can be reburied by a single storm, and new artifacts can migrate into the area from adjacent, unexplored sections. It's estimated that at the known wreck sites, salvers have recovered perhaps 60 to 70% of the accessible artifacts. But accessible is key. Some artifacts are buried under 6, 8, 10 feet of compacted sand. To reach them would require excavation on a scale that's not practical or permitted. Florida regulates how much disturbance salvers can cause to the seafloor. Environmental concerns limit the use of heavy equipment. So artifacts remain, buried too deeply to reach with current methods, waiting for nature to expose them, which might take decades or centuries, or might never happen at all. And then there are the artifacts that have migrated away from the wreck sites entirely. Currents don't just move sand, they move objects. A gold coin lying on the seafloor can be picked up by bottom currents and transported. Not far, maybe 100 feet, maybe half a mile, but far enough that it ends up outside the area that salvers are permitted to work.
Over 300 years, this process has scattered artifacts across a huge area. Treasure hunters call it the scatter field, the region around a wreck where artifacts can be found, sometimes miles from the main wreck site. Some of the coins found on beaches after storms come from this scatter field. They're not washing directly out of wreck sites. They've been transported by currents, buried in the sand in random locations, and then exposed again by storms. Which means there are probably artifacts from the 1715 fleet scattered along much more than 50 miles of coastline, perhaps 100 miles, perhaps the entire east coast of Florida. Single coins, small artifacts, items that have drifted far from their origin.
Finding them would require searching the entire coast systematically, which is impractical. So they remain, waiting to be found by chance, by someone walking the beach with a metal detector, by a diver exploring a reef and noticing something unusual in the sand. Now, let's talk about specific artifacts that researchers believe are still out there, tantalizing possibilities based on historical records and what hasn't been found yet. The fleet manifests, incomplete as they are, mention certain high-value items that have never been recovered. One manifest references a solid gold religious statue, approximately 2 feet tall, commissioned by a wealthy merchant as a gift to a cathedral in Spain. It was listed as being aboard one of the ships. It's never been found. Where is it? Buried under 10 feet of sand at a known wreck site? Scattered into pieces that aren't recognizable? In deep water, still intact in some nobleman's chest? No one knows, but it's worth conservatively several $100,000 in gold weight alone, as an artifact potentially priceless. Another manifest entry describes a collection of emeralds, not jewelry, but raw stones, being transported from the Colombian mines. The collection was estimated to contain over 100 carats of high-quality emeralds. Some emeralds have been found at the 1715 sites, but not matching this description, not in this quantity. So either the manifest was exaggerated or the collection is still out there. And then there's the persistent legend of the captain's strongbox, personal treasure belonging to General Ubilla, the fleet commander. Historical records indicate that senior officers often kept private treasure, their own wealth, not part of the official cargo. This was common practice, a way of avoiding taxes and regulations.
Ubilla survived the hurricane. He made it to shore and took command of the survivors. But his ship, the Capitana, was destroyed. And if he had a personal strongbox aboard, it went down with the ship. That strongbox has never been found, or at least it's never been publicly reported as found. Treasure hunters are notoriously secretive. If someone did recover a captain's strongbox full of gold and didn't report it, we'd never know. But assuming it's still out there, it would be significant, not just for its monetary value, but for what it might contain: personal papers, navigational instruments, items of historical importance beyond their material worth. So what technology might eventually find these remaining secrets? Current salvage technology is already quite advanced, but several emerging technologies could revolutionize the search for the remaining 1715 treasure. First, improved sub-bottom profiling. This technology uses sonar to see beneath the seafloor, revealing objects buried in sediment. Current systems can penetrate a few feet. Next-generation systems, using different frequencies and signal processing, might be able to see 10, 15, even 20 feet into the sediment. This would allow salvors to map entire wreck sites, including buried sections, without excavation, to know exactly where artifacts are before they start digging. Second, autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs. These are robotic submarines that can survey large areas systematically, using multiple sensors simultaneously. They're already used in deep-water archaeology. Adapting them for shallow water salvage work would allow much more efficient searching of potential wreck zones. Third, improved metal detection. Current metal detectors work well, but they're limited by range and discrimination. New technologies, using different physics principles like gradiometry or advanced induction, might be able to detect specific metals at greater depths and through more interference. Imagine a detector that could distinguish between iron from ship fittings and gold from coins while still buried under 6 feet of sand. That technology is being developed now. Within a decade, it might be available to treasure hunters. Fourth, and perhaps most intriguing, environmental DNA analysis. Every organism leaves genetic traces in the environment, and wooden shipwrecks are ecosystems, home to bacteria, fungi, marine organisms that colonize the wood. By analyzing sediment for the DNA signatures of these wood-boring organisms, researchers might be able to detect buried shipwrecks even when no metal is present. to find locations where ships went down but that have been completely buried by sediment.
This technology is experimental, but it's showing promise in other archaeological contexts. Could it locate the missing ships of the 1715 fleet? Possibly. And finally, there's artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms that can analyze vast amounts of sonar data, identifying patterns that human observers might miss. AI that can predict where artifacts are likely to have migrated based on current patterns in coastal dynamics. Some salvage companies are already using AI to prioritize search areas. As the technology improves, it will become more central to treasure hunting operations. But here's the fundamental challenge. No matter how good the technology becomes, there are limits. Some treasure is simply too scattered, individual coins spread across hundreds of square miles of seafloor. Finding them all would be impossible, no matter how advanced your equipment. Some artifacts are too degraded. Organic materials, wood, leather, fabric, have long since decomposed. Metal objects may have corroded away to nothing. After 300 years in seawater, not everything survives. And some locations are protected. Florida has designated certain wreck sites as archaeological preserves. Salvage is prohibited. The sites are left intact for future study, for educational purposes, for historical preservation. This protects the wrecks, but it also means that whatever artifacts remain at those sites will stay there, undiscovered, uninvestigated, waiting. So when we ask, what's still out there, the answer is complex. There are 3 ships whose precise locations remain unknown. At least one might be in deep water, intact, full of treasure. There are millions of dollars worth of artifacts still buried at known wreck sites, too deep or too scattered to recover with current methods. There are high-value items mentioned in historical records that have never been found, religious artifacts, collections of gemstones, officers' personal treasure. And there are countless small items, coins, jewelry, ship fittings, scattered across miles of seafloor, waiting to be exposed by the right storm or discovered by the right person at the right time. The 1715 fleet will never be fully recovered, never be completely understood, never stop revealing secrets. Because the ocean doesn't give up everything. It parcels out its treasures slowly, and it ensures that there's always something left to find. Always another mystery waiting beneath the sand. "300 years have passed since that July night in 1715, when 11 ships carrying the wealth of an empire met their fate in a hurricane off the Florida coast. Over 1,000 lives were lost, millions of pesos worth of treasure scattered across the seafloor, the greatest maritime disaster in Spanish colonial history. But the story didn't end with the shipwrecks. In many ways, it was only beginning. Because the 1715 fleet didn't just sink into the ocean and fade into history. It shaped the future of an entire region. It created a culture. It spawned legends that endure to this day. Let's talk about the legacy of the Lost Armada, how it changed Florida, why it remains one of the most significant maritime losses in history, and why, after 3 centuries, its mystery still captivates us. First, the immediate impact on Florida's development. In 1715, Florida was largely unsettled by Europeans. St. Augustine existed as a Spanish outpost, but beyond that, the peninsula was frontier territory, dense vegetation, mosquito-infested swamps, indigenous peoples who had little interest in European colonization. But the shipwrecks changed that. Suddenly, the Florida coast became strategically important.
The Spanish established salvage camps. They brought workers, supplies, equipment. They built temporary settlements along the coast near the wreck sites. And some of those settlements never left. The town of Sebastian, Florida, one of the primary treasure hunting centers today, traces its origins to the salvage operations of the 1715 fleet. Workers settled there. Fishermen discovered the area had good harbors, and slowly a community formed. Other coastal towns have similar stories. The treasure brought people to Florida, and once there, they found reasons to stay.
The salvage operations also brought attention to Florida's strategic location. It controlled the shipping lanes between the Caribbean and Europe. Any fleet sailing from Havana to Spain had to pass along Florida's coast. This made Florida valuable in ways that went beyond treasure, and it influenced later territorial disputes between Spain and Britain, between Spain and the emerging United States. The 1715 fleet disaster was a factor in Florida's eventual transfer to British control in 1763. Spain's weakened position after losing the fleet and the financial crisis it exacerbated made it difficult to maintain distant colonies. Florida was traded to Britain in exchange for Havana, which the British had captured during the 7 Years' War. So in a very real sense, the loss of the treasure fleet shaped Florida's political history. But the more lasting impact was cultural. The 1715 fleet created the treasure post, not just as a geographic location, but as an idea, a place where fortune literally washes ashore, where anyone with patience and a metal detector might find gold. This mythology is powerful, and it's drawn people to Florida for centuries. In the 19th century, stories about Spanish treasure brought adventurers and fortune seekers. Most found nothing, but the stories persisted. In the 20th century, when modern technology made treasure hunting practical, Florida became the center of underwater salvage. More treasure hunting operations are based in Florida than anywhere else in the world, and almost all of them can trace their lineage, directly or indirectly, to the 1715 wrecks. The techniques developed for salvaging the 1715 fleet, the mailbox deflector, systematic surveying, cooperation with state archaeologists, became the template for treasure hunting worldwide.
Mel Fisher, who found the Atocha in 1985, learned his trade on the 1715 wrecks. Countless other treasure hunters got their start searching for Spanish gold off the Florida coast. The 1715 fleet didn't just change Florida, it created an industry, and it changed how we think about shipwrecks. Before the 1715 salvage operations, shipwrecks were either forgotten or stripped by salvors with no regard for historical value. The artifacts were melted down, sold as curiosities, or lost. But the publicity around the 1715 finds in the 1960s brought attention to the historical significance of shipwrecks. Archaeologists got involved. Laws were passed to protect wreck sites. The concept of maritime archaeology as a discipline owes much to the controversies and discoveries around the 1715 fleet. Today, there's an ongoing tension between treasure hunters and archaeologists, and the 1715 wrecks sit at the center of that debate. Some argue that these sites should be left intact, that salvage destroys context, that artifacts removed from their original location lose scientific value, that future technologies might allow us to study these sites in ways we can't yet imagine. Others argue that salvage is preservation, that artifacts left on the seafloor will eventually be destroyed by storms and corrosion, that recovering and conserving them is the only way to save them, and that treasure hunters, working within regulations, are doing important work. It's a debate without easy answers, but it's a debate that started with the 1715 fleet, and it continues today. Now let's talk about why the 1715 fleet remains one of the greatest maritime losses in history. In terms of treasure value, it's difficult to calculate exactly, but conservative estimates suggest the fleet carried between $400 million and $600 million worth of precious metals in modern currency. Add in the value of rare artifacts, Chinese porcelain, emeralds, religious objects, and the total could be much higher. Only a handful of shipwreck losses rival that value. The Nuestra Señora de Atocha, which Mel Fisher found, carried similar wealth. The Manila galleons that crossed the Pacific sometimes carried comparable treasure. The East India Company ships occasionally sank with fortunes aboard. But what makes the 1715 fleet unique is the scale of the disaster. Not one ship, but 10. not scattered across the ocean, but concentrated along 50 miles of coastline, and not in deep water beyond reach, but in shallow water where salvage was possible, both in the 18th century and today.
It's the perfect shipwreck treasure story, valuable enough to be worth searching for, accessible enough to actually find, and complex enough to keep researchers and treasure hunters occupied for centuries. In terms of human cost, the 1715 disaster was catastrophic. Over 1,000 people died. For context, the Titanic disaster killed about 1,500 people, and that's remembered as one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in history. The 1715 fleet deserves similar recognition, but because it happened in 1715, before modern media, before instant communication, the human tragedy has been somewhat overshadowed by the treasure story. But those were real people, sailors with families, soldiers who'd been sent to guard treasure they'd never benefit from, merchants whose entire fortunes were invested in the cargo, passengers, including women and children, who were just trying to cross the ocean. All of them died, or watched their companions die in the terror of that hurricane night, and their sacrifice, their loss, is part of the legacy too. Then there's the impact on treasure hunting culture, the mythology, the dreams. The 1715 fleet has inspired countless treasure hunters, some professional, some amateur, some who've dedicated their entire lives to the search, and it's inspired popular culture too. Books have been written about it, films reference it, video games include missions to find Spanish treasure. It's become part of the collective imagination, the idea that there's gold beneath the waves waiting to be found. This has positive and negative aspects. On the positive side, it's encouraged ocean exploration. It's brought attention to maritime history. It's created jobs and economic activity in coastal communities. On the negative side, it's also encouraged reckless salvage, treasure hunters who damage sites in their rush to find artifacts, people who ignore regulations, looters who steal from protected archaeological sites. The 1715 fleet is at the center of this cultural phenomenon. For better or worse, it's shaped how we think about sunken treasure. And finally, there's the enduring mystery, the treasure still waiting to be found. Because despite everything, despite 300 years of searching, despite millions of dollars recovered, despite sophisticated technology and dedicated salvage operations, the 1715 fleet isn't finished. There are still wrecks that haven't been found, still artifacts buried under sand, still coins washing ashore after storms, still secrets waiting in the deep. And that mystery is perhaps the most important part of the legacy, because it reminds us that the world still has unknowns, still has frontiers, still has places where discovery is possible. In an age where we can see any location on Earth through satellite imagery, where GPS coordinates can guide us anywhere, where everything seems mapped and documented and known, the 1715 fleet offers something rare. True mystery, genuine unknowing, the possibility that you could walk along a Florida beach tomorrow and find a gold coin that hasn't been touched by human hands in 3 centuries. That possibility matters. It keeps us curious, keeps us searching, keeps us believing that the past isn't completely lost, that connections to history still exist, tangible and real. The 1715 fleet is more than just a shipwreck. It's a story about ambition and disaster, about wealth and loss, about the power of nature and the persistence of human curiosity. It's a story about sailors who sailed into a storm they couldn't survive, about Spanish officials who tried desperately to recover what was lost, about modern treasure hunters who've dedicated their lives to continuing that search. And it's a story that's still being written, because the ocean hasn't finished telling it. Every storm reveals a little more. Every discovery adds another chapter. 300 years ago, 11 ships left Havana carrying the wealth of an empire. 10 of them sank, and in sinking, they became something greater than they were when they sailed. They became legend, mystery, history that you can hold in your hand if you're lucky enough to find a piece of it. The legacy of the lost Armada isn't just the treasure, it's the search, the hope,
the persistence across centuries, the connection between then and now. It's the knowledge that beneath the waves, beneath the sand, the past is waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, it reveals itself. That's the true legacy. Not the gold or silver or emeralds, but the mystery that endures, the story that continues, the treasure that's still, after all these years, waiting to be found.
The 1715 fleet disaster changed history, changed Florida, changed how we think about shipwrecks and treasure and the power of the ocean. But more than that, it gave us a story that refuses to end, that continues to captivate 3 centuries later, that reminds us the world still has mysteries worth pursuing. And along the Florida coast where those ships went down, the ocean keeps its vigil, guarding secrets, revealing them slowly, ensuring that the story of the lost Armada will continue for generations to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed exploring the mystery of the 1715 Spanish treasure fleet, please subscribe to The Drowned History. We bring you news stories every week, tales of shipwrecks, lost civilizations, and the mysteries hidden beneath the waves. And if you're fascinated by what lies in the deepest, darkest parts of the ocean, you won't want to miss our full-length documentary, The Deep Sea Mysteries, the strangest discoveries made beneath 10,000 meters. From creatures that shouldn't exist to sounds with no known source, from ghost ships to underwater anomalies, we descend into the Hadal Zone and explore the most extreme environment on Earth. It's 3 hours of deep-sea exploration you won't forget. You'll find it linked in the description below. Hit that like button if this story captivated you. Leave a comment telling us if you could search for any shipwreck treasure in the world, which would it be, and where are you watching from? The ocean holds countless stories, and we're here to tell them. Until next time, remember, the past isn't always buried on land. Sometimes it's beneath the waves, waiting, patient, and every now and then it washes ashore. This has been The Drowned History, where the past lies beneath the waves.